My husband slapped me in front of his coworkers over a joke, so I destroyed his career. I never thought a single moment could unravel an entire life, but standing in that crowded restaurant with my cheek still burning from my husband's hand, I realized some lines once crossed can never be uncrossed. My name is Sarah, and for 8 years I thought I knew the man I married, believed in the fairy tale we'd built together, trusted that our love was strong enough to weather any storm. But on that humid Friday evening in July, surrounded by his laughing coworkers and their pitying stares, everything I thought I knew shattered like glass hitting concrete. The slap echoed through the restaurant, silencing conversations at nearby tables, freezing smiles mid-laugh. And in that awful silence, I understood that my husband Marcus had just made the biggest mistake of his life. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't the kind of woman who would just walk away quietly and let him continue living his perfect life while I nursed my wounds in private. Let me take you back to the beginning so you understand exactly how we got here and why what I did next was absolutely justified. Marcus and I met in college during our junior year at a mutual friend's birthday party, where he spilled beer on my favorite white dress and spent the next hour apologizing while trying to dab it clean with napkins. He was charming, ambitious, studying computer engineering while I was working toward my business degree, and we fell into that easy kind of love that feels like coming home. After graduation, we moved to Seattle together, where he landed a job at a prestigious tech company called Innovate Tech, and I started working my way up in marketing at a smaller firm. We got married 3 years later in a small ceremony by the waterfront, promising to support each other through everything, to be partners in every sense of the word. For the first few years, we were exactly that, celebrating each other's victories, supporting through the failures, building what I truly believed was an unshakable foundation. But success changes people in ways you don't always see coming until it's too late to stop the transformation. Marcus started climbing the corporate ladder fast, getting promotion after promotion, and with each new title came longer hours, bigger responsibilities, and a growing ego that I barely recognized. He started talking differently, acting like he was somehow superior, making comments about my little marketing job compared to his real career in tech innovation. The man who used to ask about my day and actually listen started checking his phone while I talked, interrupting me to take calls from colleagues, canceling our date nights because something came up at work that was always somehow more important than us. I told myself it was just a phase, that the pressure would ease up, that we'd find our way back to each other. But deep down, I knew something fundamental had shifted in our relationship, and I was losing him to his ambition. The problems really started accelerating about 6 months before that fateful dinner, when Marcus got promoted to Senior Director of Product Development. Suddenly, he was managing a team of 30 people, reporting directly to the VP, attending executive meetings, and acting like he'd personally invented the internet. His coworkers became his new best friends, the people he spent more time with than me, the audience for his jokes and stories, and the inflated version of himself he'd created. He'd come home and talk endlessly about Brad from engineering, or Jessica from design, or Tom from marketing, people I'd never met but somehow knew everything about from his constant stories. When I suggested we host a dinner party so I could finally meet these people who consumed so much of his life, he hesitated, made excuses, and I realized with a sinking feeling that he didn't want his two worlds colliding. It took 3 months of pushing before he finally agreed to a group dinner at Marcello's, an upscale Italian place downtown, and I should have known from his reluctance that the evening was going to be a disaster. The night started innocuously enough, with introductions and small talk as we waited for everyone to arrive at the restaurant. I met Brad, the cocky engineer who talked too loud, Jessica with her designer clothes and dismissive smile, Tom, who seemed nice enough, and 4 others whose names blurred together in the chaos of handshakes and forced pleasantries. Marcus was in his element, holding court at the head of the table, telling stories about projects and office politics that made everyone laugh, and I sat there smiling and playing the supportive wife role I'd perfected over the years. The drinks flowed freely, the appetizers came and went, and I started to relax, thinking maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. Then, Brad started telling a story about a disastrous presentation Marcus had given early in his career, before anyone at this table knew him, and Marcus jumped in to defend himself with exaggerated details that I knew weren't quite true. I saw my opportunity to join the conversation, to be part of his world for once. So I laughed and made a joke about how Marcus still couldn't use PowerPoint without calling me for help. The table went quiet in that uncomfortable way that makes your stomach drop and you immediately know you've made a terrible mistake. Marcus's face turned red, his jaw clenched, and I saw something dangerous flash in his eyes that I'd never seen before in 8 years together. Before I could backtrack or apologize or laugh it off, he turned to me with a voice so cold it felt like ice water down my spine and said I should keep my mouth shut about things I didn't understand. I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking, trying to lighten the mood, and made another comment about how I understood plenty since I had to teach him how to use half the features on his phone. The words were barely out of my mouth when his hand shot across the distance between us and connected with my cheek with a crack that seemed to echo off every wall in the restaurant. My head snapped to the side, my cheek exploded in pain, and for a moment I couldn't process what had just happened, because this couldn't be real. Marcus couldn't have just hit me in front of all these people. The silence that followed was deafening as every person at our table and several nearby tables stared in absolute shock. I touched my cheek, felt the heat radiating from where his hand had connected, and looked at my husband with tears streaming down my face, not from pain, but from the complete humiliation and betrayal of what he'd just done. Marcus stared back at me with an expression that wasn't remorse or horror at his own actions, but annoyance, like I was the problem here, like I'd somehow forced his hand by daring to embarrass him in front of his precious coworkers. Jessica looked down at her plate. Brad shifted uncomfortably. Tom started to say something, then stopped, and the rest of them suddenly became very interested in their drinks or phones, or anything that meant they didn't have to acknowledge what they'd just witnessed. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor with a screech that made everyone flinch, grabbed my purse with shaking hands, and walked out of that restaurant with my head held high, even though inside I was completely falling apart. I drove home in a daze, tears blurring my vision, my cheek throbbing, my mind racing through everything that had just happened and trying to make sense of it. How had we gotten here, to a place where the man who promised to love and cherish me would strike me in public like I was nothing, like our entire relationship meant nothing, like I deserved to be punished for making a simple joke? I kept waiting for my phone to ring, for Marcus to call with apologies and explanations and promises that it would never happen again, but the phone stayed silent as I drove through the Seattle streets. When I got home, I went straight to our bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of our bed staring at my reflection in the mirror on our dresser. The woman looking back at me had a red handprint on her cheek, mascara streaked down her face, and eyes that looked hollow and broken, and I barely recognized her as myself. That's when something inside me shifted, when the grief and humiliation transformed into something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous than tears. Marcus came home 3 hours later, and I heard him moving around downstairs, opening the fridge, turning on the TV like nothing had happened. He didn't come upstairs, didn't knock on the bedroom door, didn't apologize through the woods separating us, and that silence told me everything I needed to know about where we stood. I spent that entire night lying awake, not sleeping, just thinking and planning, and deciding exactly how I was going to handle this situation, because one thing became crystal clear as the hours ticked by. If Marcus thought he could just hit me and move on with his life, if he believed there would be no consequences for humiliating me like that in front of his coworkers, if he imagined I would just forgive and forget and continue being his supportive wife, then he didn't know me at all. The Sarah he married might have been soft and forgiving and willing to work through anything, but the Sarah lying in that bed with a bruised cheek was someone entirely different, someone capable of things I'd never considered before. By morning, I had a plan that was both beautiful and terrible in its simplicity and devastation. I knew Marcus's career was everything to him, the source of his identity and pride and sense of self-worth, the thing he'd sacrificed our marriage to build. I also knew something he'd told me in confidence months ago when he'd had too much wine and got loose-lipped about office politics, something about a project he was leading that involved some questionable decisions regarding user data privacy. At the time, I'd filed it away as just more work talk I didn't really care about, but now that information became the weapon I needed to destroy everything he'd built. I spent the weekend documenting everything I could remember from his drunken confession, searching through his home office when he left for a run, photographing documents he'd carelessly left out, building a case that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Marcus and I didn't speak that entire weekend beyond the bare minimum necessary to coexist in the same house. He slept in the guest room, I stayed in our bedroom, and we moved around each other like ghosts haunting the same space, but existing in different dimensions. On Sunday night, he finally tried to talk to me, standing in the kitchen doorway with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face that might have been guilt or might have been irritation that I was still upset. He said we needed to talk about what happened, that things got out of hand, that he'd been stressed and I'd pushed him too far with my jokes in front of his colleagues. Notice how he framed it, not as an apology but as an explanation that somehow made it partially my fault. And in that moment, any lingering doubt I had about what I was planning to do completely evaporated. I told him calmly that we could talk later, that I needed more time to process, and he seemed relieved to avoid the conversation, going back to his room while I finalized the details of his destruction. Monday morning, I put my plan into action with a clear head and steady hands that surprised me. I'd created an anonymous email account over the weekend and drafted a detailed message to Innovate Tech's ethics committee, their legal department, and several board members outlining the data privacy concerns with Marcus's project. I included specific details about how user information was being collected without proper consent, how the data was being shared with third parties for profit, how the company was potentially violating multiple federal regulations regarding digital privacy. I attached the photos I'd taken of documents from his home office, time-stamped and annotated, making it clear this wasn't speculation but actual evidence from someone with inside knowledge. Then I sent the emails from a coffee shop across town using their public Wi-Fi, covering my digital tracks the way Marcus had once taught me when he was explaining cybersecurity basics, using his own knowledge against him in a way that felt perfectly poetic. The response was faster than I'd anticipated, as the ethics committee apparently took data privacy violations very seriously. By Tuesday afternoon, Marcus came home early, looking pale and shaken, his usual confidence completely absent as he paced around the living room making frantic phone calls. I asked what was wrong with fake concern in my voice, and he told me the company had launched an internal investigation into his project, that someone had sent anonymous allegations to the executives, that his entire career was potentially in jeopardy. He looked at me with desperate eyes and asked if I would support him through this, if I'd stand by him while he fought these charges. And the audacity of that request after what he'd done to me actually made me laugh. I told him of course I'd support him, playing the role of dutiful wife one last time, while inside I felt nothing but cold satisfaction watching him panic. The investigation moved quickly once it started, with Innovate Tech bringing in external auditors and legal counsel to review the project. Within a week, they'd confirmed the violations, traced them directly to decisions Marcus had made as project director, and determined that he'd knowingly bypassed the proper approval channels to implement features that compromised user privacy. The company was facing potential fines in the millions, lawsuits from users whose data had been mishandled, and a public relations nightmare once the story got out. Marcus was suspended immediately pending the completion of the investigation, sent home with instructions not to contact anyone on his team or discuss the case with colleagues. He spent his days at home now, making desperate calls to lawyers, drinking too much, alternating between rage at whoever had reported him and denial that he'd done anything wrong. I watched his descent with detached interest, like observing a documentary about someone else's life, feeling no sympathy for the man who'd hit me and never properly apologized. 2 weeks after I sent those emails, Innovate Tech terminated Marcus's employment for gross misconduct and violation of company policy. They issued a statement about their commitment to user privacy and data protection, announced they were scrapping the entire project and implementing new oversight procedures, and made it clear that the former director responsible had been let go. Marcus's name wasn't mentioned publicly, but in the tech industry, word travels fast, and soon everyone knew why he'd been fired. His coworkers, those same people who'd witnessed him slap me at dinner, started posting vague messages on social media about integrity and accountability, distancing themselves from him as his reputation crumbled. Brad unfriended him on Facebook, Jessica stopped returning his texts, and Tom posted something about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. And I wondered if any of them connected what had happened to that dinner at Marcello's. Marcus spiraled quickly without the structure and identity his career had provided, spending days in his pajamas, letting our house fall into disarray, drinking before noon. He tried to find another job, but the circumstances of his firing made him essentially unhireable in the tech industry, at least in Seattle, at least at the level he'd been at before. The few interviews he managed to get went nowhere once companies did their due diligence and discovered why he'd left Innovate Tech. His confidence, that inflated ego that had made him think he could treat me however he wanted, deflated like a punctured balloon until he was a shadow of the man who'd stood at the head of that restaurant table holding court. I watched all of this happen while maintaining my mask of supportive wife, bringing him meals he didn't eat, suggesting job opportunities he didn't pursue, pretending to believe him when he insisted he'd done nothing wrong and this was all a conspiracy against him. 3 months after that dinner, I filed for divorce with a lawyer who specialized in domestic abuse cases. I documented everything: the slap witnessed by multiple people, the lack of apology or remorse, the deteriorating relationship, his current unemployment and drinking, building a case that would leave him with as little as possible from our marriage. My lawyer was a fierce woman in her 50s named Patricia, who listened to my story with knowing eyes and promised me we'd make sure Marcus paid for what he'd done in every way the law allowed. We filed for divorce on the grounds of abuse, requested a restraining order based on the assault, and demanded our house, most of our savings, and alimony until I finished the graduate degree I'd put on hold to support his career. Marcus was served papers at the house one Thursday morning, and the look of complete shock on his face when he realized I was actually leaving him almost made me laugh out loud. The divorce proceedings were ugly and bitter as Marcus fought every single demand, despite having no leverage and no good options. He hired a cheap lawyer who tried to argue that one slap didn't constitute abuse, that I was overreacting, that I'd humiliated him first with my jokes, which I hadn't even done intentionally. But we had witnesses, including some of his own coworkers who agreed to testify about what they'd seen at the restaurant, people who'd apparently been more disturbed by his actions than their silence that night had suggested. Patricia demolished every argument his lawyer made, painted him as an abusive husband who'd let career success go to his head, emphasized his current unemployment and instability, and made it clear to the judge that I needed protection and compensation. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd probably seen countless cases like ours, ruled in my favor on almost every point, granting me the house, 70% of our savings, and alimony for 4 years while I completed my MBA. Marcus moved out of our house into a small apartment in a cheaper part of Seattle, taking only his clothes and a few personal items. I watched him pack his car from the living room window. This man I'd once loved more than anything, now reduced to a bitter stranger loading cardboard boxes into a dented sedan. He looked up at the house one last time before driving away, and I wondered if he understood yet that everything that had happened was a direct result of that single moment of violence at Marcello's. Probably not, because men like Marcus never really understand how their actions have consequences, never make the connection between what they do and what happens to them afterward. He likely blamed me for ruining his life, saw himself as the victim of his vindictive ex-wife, told people I'd overreacted to one mistake and destroyed him for it, never acknowledging that he'd destroyed himself the moment he raised his hand to me. I spent the next few months rebuilding my life from the foundation up, reclaiming the space in our house and making it truly mine. I enrolled in an MBA program at the University of Washington, using the alimony and my share of our savings to fund my education and living expenses. I started therapy to process everything that had happened, working through the betrayal and abuse with a counselor who helped me understand that none of it had been my fault, regardless of what joke I'd made. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected during my marriage, joined a book club, started yoga classes, slowly building a new life that didn't revolve around supporting someone else's dreams while my own withered. It was hard sometimes, lonely sometimes, but it was mine in a way my life hadn't been for years, and that freedom was worth every difficult moment. The story of Marcus's downfall spread through the tech community like wildfire, as these things do in interconnected industries. People talked about the promising director who'd thrown away his career over data privacy violations, speculated about who'd reported him, debated whether Innovate Tech had overreacted or done exactly the right thing. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Marcus had moved back to his hometown in Ohio, taken a job at his brother's small IT consulting firm, basically starting over from scratch in his late 30s. Part of me felt a twinge of something that might have been pity when I heard that, remembering the ambitious young man I'd fallen in love with in college, but mostly I felt satisfied that justice had been served in its own way. He'd hit me in public, humiliated me in front of strangers, shown me exactly how little I mattered to him when his ego was on the line, and now he'd lost everything that mattered to him. I never told anyone what I'd done, never admitted to being the anonymous source who'd reported Marcus's project violations. My friends assumed someone from his company had blown the whistle. Marcus probably thought it was a rival or someone with a grudge from work, and I let everyone believe whatever story made sense to them. The truth was mine to keep, a secret that I carried like a smooth stone in my pocket, taking it out occasionally to examine in private moments when I needed to remember my own strength. What I'd done wasn't entirely ethical, using personal knowledge against him that way, but it also wasn't wrong given what he'd done to me, and what he'd been doing to users whose privacy he violated for profit. Sometimes the right thing and the ethical thing aren't quite the same, and I made my peace with walking that ambiguous line. 2 years after that dinner at Marcello's, I graduated with my MBA with honors and landed a position as marketing director at a startup that valued my skills and experience. I was thriving in ways I hadn't allowed myself to thrive during my marriage, growing into the person I might have always been if I hadn't spent years making myself smaller to accommodate Marcus's expanding ego. I started dating again, cautiously at first, learning to trust carefully and set boundaries firmly, carrying the lessons from my marriage like armor. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good, authentically good, in a way that had nothing to do with keeping up appearances or supporting someone else's definition of success. I'd built something real from the ashes of everything that had burned down, and that knowledge carried me through difficult days. Looking back now, I can see the whole journey clearly, from that Friday evening when everything changed to this moment years later. Some people might judge me for what I did, might say I went too far or should have handled it differently, should have just divorced him and moved on without destroying his career. But those people didn't feel the burn of humiliation in that restaurant, didn't see the complete lack of remorse in his eyes, didn't understand that men like Marcus only learn lessons when they lose what matters most to them. I gave him exactly what he gave me, took away his dignity and future the way he tried to take away mine, and I've never regretted that decision for a single moment. Would I do it again if somehow transported back to that night with the knowledge of everything that would follow? Absolutely I would, maybe even faster and more thoroughly. The truth is that some people don't deserve second chances or forgiveness or the benefit of the doubt. They deserve consequences and justice and to feel the full weight of their actions crushing down on them. Marcus was one of those people, someone who'd been given everything, privilege and opportunity and love, and squandered it all because he thought he was untouchable. That slap in the restaurant was just the final culmination of months of disrespect and dismissiveness, the moment when his true character showed itself in the ugliest possible way. Everything I did afterward was simply holding up a mirror to show him and everyone else exactly who he really was beneath the charm and success and carefully constructed image. If that makes me vengeful or vindictive or any other adjective people want to use, I can live with that. Because I can also live with myself knowing I didn't just accept abuse quietly.